Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast, part 2 of our conversation with Jason Eaker, the head basketball coach for Oklahoma Baptist University men's basketball program, is sponsored by Compassion International. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. That's the website to go. Sponsor a child today. $38 a month, releasing a child from poverty. It's November. We're always looking for ways to help. It's getting close to the holiday season. Why not impact a child, directly impact a child by releasing them from poverty? $38 a month. You can do that by going to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Food, education, medical care, vocational training. This is what every child needs. This is what every child deserves, and you can make it happen through Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. Today's guest on the podcast, Jason Eaker. This is part 2 of our conversation with Jason. He is the head basketball coach at Oklahoma Baptist University for their men's program. 15 years as a Division I assistant, and this is his first year as a head coach. Now, Oklahoma Baptist is a Division II program, and prior to that, Jason was at Mercer, where he was an assistant coach there in Division I from 2013 to 2018, and then prior to that, he was a Liberty basketball assistant coach from 2007 to 2013. Now, if you heard part 1 of our conversation with Jason, you got to know him a little bit, and I would highly recommend you go listen to that part before you listen to part 2 and hear Jason's journey. Just hear about becoming a head coach, that adjustment, what that's like, why and how he became a coach, and why Oklahoma Baptist was the place for him to have that journey, to have that opportunity, I should say, to become a head coach. And then we hear a little bit about recruiting. Recruiting is so difficult, and it's such a grind. It's such a necessary evil in many ways for coaches. And Jason talks about that recruiting lifestyle, which is tough, but it's also very rewarding in building relationships with the student athletes. And that's, what it's about. And in many ways, what your program is judged by is how you recruit and the type of players that you bring to your program. So that's part 1. Today in part 2, we get to Jason's restoration story, if you will. He had an incident when he was at Liberty University, and I really wanted to talk to Jason about that incident. But I just think there was so much there that we wanted to break this episode into 2 parts and just ask Jason about what happened at Liberty, what he's learned, about forgiveness and reconciliation and transparency and really second chances. Jason, in many ways, will say on this podcast that he doesn't have his job as a head basketball coach at Oklahoma Baptist if it wasn't for forgiveness, if it wasn't for God, and if it wasn't for opportunities through the relationships that he built. So I really enjoyed talking to Jay. I think he's going to be outstanding for Oklahoma Baptist, and you can just sense the character, sense the humility, and sense the man that he is, who loves Jesus and loves his players, and certainly loves his family as well. So let's get to part 2 of our conversation with Oklahoma Baptist University men's basketball coach Jason Eaker here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. Coaches, like every one of us, of course, aren't immune to life struggles and adversities. So your story is more than just basketball. It's actually one of the ways we connected a few months back, and you shared your story with me, and that's when I really knew I wanted to have you here on the podcast. Tell us about what happened. It was during your time at Liberty, and kind of take us through all of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of some of the things that you've learned through the process.
Well, I was at Liberty University. I was an assistant coach. I was working for a man named Richie McKay, who is now back at that school as the head coach. And I was on my little climb. Was wanting to be a head coach at a very young age. Had gotten some breaks along the way with my career. And Tony Bennett was at Washington State. So Tony Bennett ends up taking the head coaching job at the University of Virginia. My boss at the time was Richie McKay at Liberty. He walked into us as a staff and said, "Hey, I know you guys are probably going to be mad at me or disappointed, but I feel like God's calling me to go serve Tony Bennett at the University of Virginia, and I'll help you any way that I can, but I've got to be true to what God is calling me to do. I've been a head coach for 15 years or whatever it was, Coach McKay, and he just said, I think it's now time for me to go serve someone else. So he resigns, and in our business, no matter where you fit, if your head coach resigns and he is not going to another head coaching job, you are instantly now unemployed. And so I'm sitting there in his office, and we're all there. We're happy for Coach McKay. He, University of Virginia, Tony Bennett. How could he say no to that opportunity at that time? It was a wonderful opportunity. They had been friends. Dick Bennett had been a longtime mentor of Coach McKay, and him and Tony had been, he obviously knew what Tony was all about, as we've seen it play out. Tony's one of the best in our industry. And so, you're sitting there and you're going through all the different emotions, and you're like, you know what? This coaching business isn't really that cool. Like, we had just had Stephen Curry's, Coach McKay and I had recruited Seth Curry there. He had just decided to transfer to Duke. He was our leading scorer. Coach McKay walks out the door and goes to the University of Virginia on his journey and his path in Christ and his career. So you're sitting there, or at least I was, in a very immature way. And that should have been the time where all my, I grew up in a Christian family. That should have been the time where I really grabbed a hold of my faith. And I really, clung to God's got a plan, whether it's Jeremiah 29:11 or whatever the case may be. Yeah. But the way that I internalized that moment was, if you're going to do anything in this racket of pro or college sports, man, you got to be all out for yourself. And you got to literally take whatever responsibilities that you have, and you not only have to do well with them, but you got to hit a home run with them, and you got to hit it right now. And so we ended up hiring a man from Marquette named Dale Layer, who was a friend of mine. So I ended up keeping my job and actually getting promoted through that process. But inside of all that, I began to change. I began to dive deeper into you got to be all out for yourself, because at any moment you could be out of a job. And so that's not what happened. I should have been celebrating what God had done and how he had provided for me, and how I still was in coaching, and I was at a great place, and I was doing great with my marriage and career. But as I moved forward from that point on, looking back on it, I dove deeper and deeper into work ethic, into production, into competitiveness. Anyone that knows me knows that I have that sickness, like a lot of coaches, is that I'm ultra competitive, I can get angry at times with my competitiveness. I have some of that junk in my trunk with, some coaches that I've met have that, to where they just got to win. They have to win. And so I really clung to that. And so then I'd always been on this drug by the name of Adderall. It's to help those of us with ADHD. And I began to figure out that the more I took that medication, the more I could work. And so if I took one pill, I could work for another 3 or 4 hours. If I took another pill, I could stay up till 5 a.m. If I took another pill, I could stay up all night and work the next day. And so as I'm figuring that out, as I have this other messiness with my career involved, as I'm kind of trying to become a head coach in my own mind, not that I thought that I was close. I was a long ways away from that at that time, but that's not what was going on in my head. I began to take this pill over and over again, to the point to where now I'm addicted to it. Now I'm needing it. Now my body is attached to it. Now it's become a part of my life. Like I thought about it during the day. Like, man, when am I going to get my medication? When am I, and I was at the beginning phases, and then I got deeper into addiction. So I made the mistake of, I then took my Adderall prescription, I Xerox copied it in our office, and I took it to a pharmacy, which growing up the way that I did, not that it doesn't make it complete sin, is I didn't know what the word felony meant. I didn't know what the legal system really was all about. So as soon as I did that, that's a felony. And so the cops come, they take me to jail. My wife comes and bails me out. And then that started a whole other cycle of my career moving forward. But so that would be the short answer to that.
Well, let's talk about, I guess, the aftermath. You know, how obviously God is a God of restoration and of reconciliation, and that's obviously taking place for you because you are now the head coach with Oklahoma Baptist. So take us through the healing process and the restoration process, and even eventually getting back into the coaching world.
Well, from that point forward, I went over to my boss's house. His name was Dale Layer. The Falwells were obviously in charge of Liberty University, a wonderful family that they are. So I instantly, my wife was an athletic director at that school. So we go find those people after she gets me out of jail to let them know that I was going to resign and get some help. So initially, all of those people involved just wanted me to get help, wanted me back with that athletic department in my role as a coach and a recruiter. So I go to rehab. I take a leave of absence with the program, have full support of everyone there. I get out of rehab. I return back to the job. A few months pass. My arrest and the felony has still not been made public as far as newspapers or message boards or whatever.
Right.
So as we move forward, I thought at the time that it was kind of God's plan or mercy or restoration that it had not been made public. I was obviously wrong. Ended up becoming public when I went to court and pled guilty to what everyone there knew I was guilty of to begin with. We were 0-7, I think, at the time. I had recruited the majority of those kids. They, whenever something like that becomes public at a school with, the mission of that school is to build champions for Christ, they put me on administrative leave. Long story short, I was on administrative leave all year. I ended up parting ways with the school 1 week before the NCAA tournament, effectively ending my coaching career. I was never going to be heard from again in coaching. That team actually ended up going to the NCAA tournament that next week. My wife was there. Obviously, all those kids and families were there. We were the losingest team one of the losingest teams ever to make the NCAA tournament. So whether it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, as they were telling our team's story about, hey, these losers now became winners and it's at Liberty and God. And, I was a part of the story, but for me, it was a very negative thing. It was just another thing of what those kids had been through, losing a coach to addiction and prescription fraud. And so whether it was my career, my self-esteem, my job, my license, they put me on probation for a year. They said if I did my probation, that a year from then they would wipe it off my record. But the damage had already been done publicly. And the way that we think about, even God can't overcome Google, is the way,
Right.
I've said that to myself many times as it not being a joke, is that, hey, God, we serve an almighty God, but God can't make my mugshot go away online. And so I moved forward. Coach Hoffman, who was now at Mercer University, the longtime coach at Oklahoma Baptist, he had tried to hire me a few other times before, but I had loved being at Liberty and wanted to be there with Richie McKay and Liberty. He ends up talking me into becoming probably the oldest graduate manager in college basketball. So I went back to graduate school at 35 years of age. My wife took a job at Mercer University, took a step back in her career on my behalf. And so we went to Mercer. That first year I was there was the year that we famously beat Duke. A year went by. One of our assistant coaches' wives actually got an assistant's job at Rice. So he resigned, and the president, who, this had nothing to do with any decision, but the president of that school and Coach Hoffman are both OBU grads. They promoted me to be an assistant coach. And so I get back on my feet there, served for another 3 years there as a full-time assistant. So it was like the first time where an HR department and a president and an AD and a head coach said, we know that this has gone on with Jason, but we've seen him work here as a volunteer, and we're not saying he's the greatest thing, but it's okay for him to be a coach. And so, each moment along the way, I could go into great detail about, each moment, whether it's getting on the plane for the first time and you having to show your ID, thinking that they're going to run a background check on you for whatever reason, or that phone call from Jake Nelp and Bob Hoffman saying that they weren't going to open the search up and they were going to give me an assistant's job. Because I applied for about 100 assistant's jobs and nobody obviously was interested in me. And that's not really abnormal, having nothing to do with Adderall.
Right.
But it's hard to get a job at ESPN. It's hard to get a job in Division I basketball. I mean, it's hard enough.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And so when you throw negativity in there, and now you're married, and now you're a little older, and now you're a graduate assistant at 35 years of old, I mean, you're not getting a job. So each step along the way, there were moments of victory, there was moments of doubt, there was moments of anger, frustration. And then, right before I got promoted to be an assistant coach, I finally sat down with my wife in tears and just said, it's over. Like, I appreciate everything that you've done and the people here at Mercer, but I'm not, it's over. I got to get on with my life and get out of coaching. And so obviously a week later I got promoted. And, similar to, my real heart is that I always wanted an opportunity to lead my own program. But as I went to the bottom, and now I'm just fighting for a salary, I'm just fighting to stay in coaching. Obviously, the furthest thing from my mind was I just wanted to be around young people. I knew that I had a passion for basketball and coaching. I knew that that was probably the only thing I was good at. And so the head coaching thing was something that I had thrown away. I had let go of that. And then for it to all come back around, that was a very powerful moment personally for me, not in what I did, but at every step along the way. And I don't want to vouch for God as if I know what God is doing, because we are called to read his word and follow him, but we don't really know what God is doing. I mean, we're just here on earth. And so I don't mean to say that I know what God is doing, but as things begin to be orchestrated in my life in a positive way, it was, at every step, it was never, this is what I did. Like this is how sinless, or this is how hard I've worked. Like at each moment, I'm like, God, thank you. Why? Man, I got to do a good job. What, are you sure, God? Why me? You start to see that the opportunities that we get or don't get, in my opinion, this is how I view my faith and my relationship with the Lord. I feel like we're at God can giveth and God can take away. I don't necessarily know that that's the right way to frame it, but at each step along the way, as far as my career and Meredith staying with me in my marriage, I feel like it's been God. I don't feel like all the work that I had done prior to getting arrested, I worked way harder back then. Right. But yet more positive things have gone on when that's not been how I thought, I'm like, God, I different times when I speak on this publicly, the one thing that I was certain of, and the biggest power that I have in my life, is I was at that point where when you Google my name, you see all the articles about Coach Eaker was arrested and the judge and Adderall and here's his mugshot. Is I just said, you know what? I got no shot. Like, I can go be a stockbroker, I can go be a fireman, but as far as coaching and the nature of these search firms, like I got no chance.
Yeah.
But the only chance that I have is Christ. And so I don't it gets me emotional just thinking about it, but I still feel that way here today with my marriage, with the transition, with our team, with leading, with I got no shot. In every morning when I wake up, whenever I embrace that, those are the days where God uses me. And the days when I'm like, man, I got to tell these kids what we're doing and they're not going to push me around. I'm a first time head coach. Like, when I think like that, like, that's what Adderall did to my life. Like, whenever I'm like, I got no shot today unless I'm right here with you. I know, God, you're with me, but unless I'm right here with you and I'm walking with you, like, I got no shot. And so it's been so true of my marriage. It's been so true of my career that I really have no business being here. I have no business being married. I have no business being a head coach, but with Christ, for the few people that will listen to this, if you have Christ, you have a shot. And that doesn't mean that our loved ones won't get sick. That doesn't mean we won't lose games. That doesn't mean any of that. But in spite of all of that, with Christ, we have a chance.
Couple more minutes here with Jason Eaker, the head coach of Oklahoma Baptist University. They open up their season November 9th against Washburn. And Jason, again, your story is powerful, and I really do appreciate how open you've been in sharing it. And I know that we talk about buzzwords in the Christian world like restoration, reconciliation, redemption, forgiveness, transparency. All of those words, you can pick one or pick them all or whatever, but I'm curious just in terms of all of what you've been through and where God has you, where he has you now. What have you learned? What have you learned from God about restoration, about forgiveness, about transparency? What have you learned from the Lord through all of this?
My boss at Liberty University at the time was a man named Dale Lair. He's now working for Buzz Williams at Virginia Tech. As I was going through that, he used to always say, I don't know, because he has a lot more life experience. He has many stories. He was the head coach at Colorado State. He was the head coach at Liberty. He's taken 2 teams to the NCAA tournament. He's just one of those coaches that everyone in the coaching business looks up to, and they know that he's not a cheater. They know he's a good man and a good coach. And so he's been a mentor to a lot of us over the years. But the one thing that he used to always say to me was, if you'll just hang in there, I know that things are really bad. Like, I know that you're really down. I know that there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to give you a job or make you happy today. He just said, but the one thing that I've found to be true in my own walk with the Lord and my own coaching journey and my own broken relationships with other believers and people in the workplace was, God has this habit of taking sin, of taking messiness, of taking missed opportunity in our faith and turning it into something good. He just said, I don't know. And he used to always say, in those of us that know him, no, like I could even impersonate him saying it, is he just said, I don't know how he does it. I don't know why. I don't know how he does it, because we're always at that point where we're like, we're not going to talk to that person ever again. I hate that person. They lied to me, or I'm never going to do this, or I hate that school. Or he just said, God just has this way of turning something bad, something sinful into something that is of value, of something that is in Christ. And I hate to say this because me and him argue a lot all the time. He was actually on staff with me last year at Mercer. But he's right. Those of us that are going through hard times or tough things in our marriage or tough things in our career, if we'll just hang in there, God does have that habit, and he showed it again in a way with my small little journey, which is meaningless to a lot of the people that are listening. But the thing that I have found out is that even when we give up on ourselves, and Daryl Strawberry, who you interviewed, his son played for us and recruited him at Mercer University and was around that family and that young man for 4 years. And I've heard him speak on this before. Even when we give up on ourselves, and his testimony is powerful. If you haven't listened to it and you're listening to this podcast, is that if you are one of his children, if you have accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior, even not when other people give up on us, because most people don't give a rip about us. But when we give up on ourselves, Christ still doesn't give up on us. And I've learned that about his character. I'm a living example of that I gave up on myself. I gave up on my career. I gave up on my dreams. And I say this in an embarrassing way. I gave up on that a long time ago. And so I didn't think that I was worthy. I thought that I had made choices that eliminated myself from ever stepping into what God would have for me. That's not how God works. And I am saying that in a point in my life where I am, celebration would be the wrong word, but I am excited to be here. I'm obviously feel blessed. I feel like God's given me this opportunity. But even if we don't get the job, Christ didn't give up on me when I was a GA and applying for all these coaching jobs. Like, even if I hadn't gotten one, that doesn't mean that Christ had given up on me. And so I've learned that about his character. I obviously say that on this podcast in a way to where it's a little bit self-serving, because I did get to what it is that I wanted to do. So some of that even rings a little hollow to me as I say it, but I can only speak to the life that I've lived, and career and marriage. And so I just feel like Christ is there with us through the good and the bad. And I'd been taught that since I was 5 years old in Altus, Oklahoma. But I've now got some skin in the game, per se, and got some sins behind me, hopefully for good. And so I just feel like the biggest thing that I've learned is that we can always come to Christ with our sin. We can always come to Christ, but he can do nothing. He can do nothing with our lives. He can do nothing with our heart if we're not honest with him and honest with ourselves, even though he already knows.
It's good. It's really good. He is Jason Eaker, the head coach at Oklahoma Baptist University. Like I mentioned, they're opening up their season November 9th against Washburn. It's Jason's first year as a head coach. And of course, listening to your story has been very inspirational, my friend. And we're going to be rooting for you. We're going to be praying for you. And of course, we wish you nothing but the best, both in the season, but of course, even more in Christ. Thanks for joining us, Jay, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And that was Jason Eaker, Oklahoma Baptist University men's basketball coach, joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I thank Jay for being here on the show, and also thank him for sharing his story. It's funny because I remember talking to him, and he might have not said this in these exact words, but it was a lot of something to do with, well, why does my story matter in the sense of how many people it's going to reach? Certainly it's mattered to him. But when we share stories, we're not sharing them to brag or to shine light on all the cool, good things that I've done or we've done. We do it to point others back to the one who is all good and all powerful, and that is God. And we also do it, and we share our stories. I've certainly shared my stories, many of them, to help others. And that's exactly what Jason wanted to do with this podcast, and what he's wanted to do in sharing his story is to help others through it, to give them, a hope, I guess, like Jeremiah 29 says, a hope in a future. That's what he wants to do. He wants to provide hope through his story. And I think he's done just that. So we appreciate Jason for being here on the podcast. We're looking forward to watching him get his season underway with Oklahoma Baptist. Like we mentioned, November 9th, it kicks off against Washburn in his Division II. So let's keep our eyes on Jason Eaker and the Oklahoma Baptist men's basketball program here in 2018-2019. Thanks for Jay for joining us. We also thank Compassion International for sponsoring this podcast for $38 a month. You can make a difference by sponsoring a child through Compassion, and you release them from poverty. That is so powerful, and you get a chance to make that difference with food, education, medical care, vocational training, all done in the name of Christ. And you, when you sponsor a child, are providing just that to that child. It's amazing. It's an opportunity for you to make a difference, releasing a child from poverty. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Sponsor a child today. I promise you, you will not regret it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. You can reach us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Sports_Spectrum is the handle. You can also find us on our YouTube channel with all of these podcasts, as well as lots of cool videos there. And all of our content, a daily devotional at 6 a.m., content daily, articles on the intersection of sports and faith, all of it can be found at sportspectrum.com. Also, your chance to subscribe to the Sports Spectrum magazine. Got a great deal going, just $18 for an entire year. Go to sportspectrum.com, check it out, and subscribe to our magazine today. Thanks for listening. You can reach me via email, jason@sportspectrum.com. Would love to hear what you think of Jason Eaker's story or any other podcast that we've done. If you have any ideas for guests that we should have on, big names, little names, small names, programs, stories we don't know about, stories everyone knows about, please send them to me, jason@sportspectrum.com. Have a great day. Thanks so much for listening and taking time out of your busy day to tune in to the Sports Spectrum podcast, the intersection of sports and faith.